Hi friends, my name is Emily. I thought I would just take some time today to wrap up the last the last few books that I read in 2020. So in November I ended up in a reading slump and didn't read anything between the 11th and the 26th when I started filming My Partner Picks My Read vlog, which I will try and link above or below. The first book that I ended up reading in a long time actually was To Be Taught If Fortunate. This is a science fiction novella, very quiet, very beautiful. Ariadne is one of 4 space explorers who have been sent out into the universe to explore other planets and document life there. It's not one way, but they're not coming back to the same world just because of the amount of time that it's going to take to travel. The motivating factor for this book that we are reading is at some point in their mission, Earth stops transmitting news to them, and they're not sure what that means. The book is positioned as this document that Ariadne is sending back to Earth for someone, if anyone still exists, to read and to connect with these space explorers that have been forgotten by a very changed Earth. It was a perfect way to get out of a reading slump. I love Becky Chambers. I expected nothing less of this, so I gave that 4 to 5 stars, and it was a new buy. Then I listened to First Test and Page on audio. These are the first 2 books in the Protector of the Small series by Tamora Pierce. This is my favorite quartet by Tamora Pierce. I was a little afraid to touch something like this while I was in a reading slump if it tarnished it, but just plugging the audiobooks in while I was working was great. Kel is the first woman to try for knighthood, following in Alana the Lioness's footsteps. Sorry, Alana. I get shit for that on the internet, but I mean, when I was 9, I pronounced it Alana, like I've always heard the name pronounced. Alana is always Alana in my mind. We'll probably never unlearn that. Alana is the first lady knight, and after that her friend and king changes the laws so that women can try openly for this position, and Kel is the first person to do that. And so we watch her on probation in First Test, and then her first 4 years as a page, officially a page, in Page. The next book that I finished was How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibrim x Kendi. This I was listening to on audio. I picked it up ages ago, and while I really appreciate the messaging and the journey, I did not like the narrator of the audiobook. It took me a while to figure this out. It took me until I started finishing the audiobook to realize what was slightly off-putting about it, and it's that it reminds me of the Baptist church sermons of my youth. While it is fine for like a 40-minute sermon to hear somebody speak in this way, to commit to like an 8-hour audiobook in that same sort of building, impassioned style of reading or speaking, I found sort of off-putting. While that style of speaking is effective in a church sermon that is like a tight time frame, it builds to a point. I mean, obviously the person recording the audiobook didn't record in full, right? They probably also recorded in those little chunks that made sense to sort of build and to speak that way, but to hear it for like more than 30 minutes, I found really exhausting, and I found myself stopping caring. The emphasis that that way of speaking builds loses its emphasis when everything is like that, right? I think I would like to revisit this text in physical form because, again, when I listened to it in smaller chunks, I found it a very personable journey that we were following Kendi on, his own anti-racist journey. And I really liked that about the text. The next book that I read was Taaqtumi. This is an anthology of Arctic horror stories. It's a lot of indigenous writers from like the Northwest Territories and then Inuit stories. And it is a real grab bag of stories. Runs the gamut of like your traditional gothic horror stories to like serial killers, cannibalism, futuristic dystopia, sci-fi. One is like very much sci-fi. I mean, like any short story collection, there are going to be hits and misses. I just think the marketing of this as horror, I expected more towards the supernatural gothic horror than the like dystopian sci-fi horror, and I almost wonder if this had been marketed as Arctic speculative fiction, if it would have framed my expectations for the text differently, and I would have felt less disappointed, because there were certain things that I was really excited about, and then there were others where I was like, this doesn't belong here. This isn't really horror. If you are at all interested in Indigenous speculative fiction, like cold northern stories, some folk stories playing with folklore, isolated communities, hunting communities, like if you go into it with the correct expectations, I think this could be a really fun collection and a great way to find new voices. There are definitely some authors in here that I am excited to seek out more of their works. Overall, the collection left me sort of wanting. The next book that I have here is The White Bone by Barbara Gowdy. It's a brilliant dumpster fire of a novel. We have high fantasy with elephant protagonists. Visionary elephant going on a quest to find the mythical white bone that will ultimately lead her herds and all of the elephants to the safe place, the utopia, place of salvation. We have hymn-singing elephants. There's mythology about creation and all of the creatures, and there are mind speakers, and it is absolutely bananas. Again, check out the My Partner Picks My reading vlog for like full thoughts on this. It was a wild ride, and I don't know if I would recommend it because it's definitely not for everybody. I did decide to give it 5 out of 5 stars because even now in December or January of 2021, I'm still thinking about that book. The next book that I read, I listened to on audio, and that was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmer. This is a really interesting combination of biology because Kimmer is a trained like scientist. She does the science and she's trained to look at nature in a very clinical way. And then she is also Indigenous. She has Indigenous knowledge on how to interact with the land. And I found her discussion of the blending of the two was fascinating. The book thinks a lot about environmental impact, how there's that symbiotic relationship between humans and nature, how if we want to survive, we need to take care of the earth that provides us with the means for survival. Again, this is another book that I would like to pick up in physical and reread. The audiobook was so good, I would just like to slow down and highlight and really take notes as I read it. I gave that 4 to 5 stars, and I borrowed that from my library. The next book that I finished was Beyond the Pale by Emily Urquhart. Her daughter was born with albinism. It's a discussion of the history of albinism in places, like the folklore and mythology that builds up around it. And the part that I struggled with the most was their trip to Africa to see how folks born with albinism in Africa are treated. And I'm not advocating that you should slaughter folks with albinism for traditional healing. Ultimately, human rights should trump and should be advocated for over traditional medicine. Like, things need to change if they harm people. However, I feel like the discussion of folks who practice traditional medicine very much pictured these more like rural parts of Africa as like backward and savage and in need of civilizing. Emily Urquhart and her husband, both of whom are white and from Canada, traveling to Africa, and like the discussions of like eating the food there, getting parasites, being violently ill, feeling super unsafe. What I am trying and failing to articulate is that the attitudes felt really colonial. It felt like a very colonist's perspective to have these debatably wealthy, if they can live in like Vancouver and have university educations, to have these white wealthy folks travel to Africa and then pass judgment on the practices of folks living there. I would have felt entirely different about a critique of traditional medicine from within the community. It's the fact that Urquhart and her husband are coming from outside the community, and the way that they're talking about it. Like, yes, it is upsetting that actual children are being sold by their parents, are being poached because they have white skin and white hair that's apparently valuable in traditional healing. The outsider looking in and passing judgment felt really gross, and I brought up the food and them feeling unsafe because it sort of added to that feeling of this being like an icky colonial narrative. It doesn't sit right. And I just wanted to sort of try and clarify that here in the editing process. I feel like that probably wasn't their intention. As a folklorist, she wanted to see how folklore impacts folks with albinism around the world and raise awareness to this human rights cause. The family history tracing, like finding her distant relatives, tracing the gene for albinism back to a family in the Niagara region, and talking to like her father's cousin, finding that common ancestor, and like finding photos of this family that had 4 children with albinism. 4 out of 5 daughters had albinism. Learning about the lives of these women, they lived full lives, because again, that was part of her worry for her daughter, because albinism affects the eyes. It results in like low vision. So it's not just a lack of pigmentation. Like finding her family roots and seeing her great aunts have like full rich lives as part of the community, when so much of the folklore is about shunning folks with like a physical difference and a disability, I think was the best part of this piece. So I gave this book 3 to 5 stars, and it truly was the family portion that saved this book. And this came from my TBR. The next book that I read this winter by Alice Oseman. It takes place on Christmas. It is a short story set in the Solitaire and Heartstopper universe. It involves the spring characters, so Tori and Charlie, and also their younger brother Oliver. Charlie has just been released from a rehab facility for his eating disorder. Christmas is obviously a time where you eat and you have to deal with family. It was nice to read a book that wasn't like, Christmas is magical and wonderful. Like, realistically, Christmas is hard for folks. And I really enjoyed seeing the sibling relationship, seeing them support each other. I gave that 4 to 5 stars. The next book that I read was If It Bleeds. Yes, I finally finished If It Bleeds. The first 2 stories in this collection I really didn't like. I read them in like early spring of 2020, put the book down, had like no interest in finishing the collection, and then just as part of this project to clean up my current reads, picked it up again. The titular story, If It Bleeds, follows Holly Gibney from the Bill Hodges trilogy and The Outsider. It was okay. It was kind of like a rehashing of The Outsider. So if you've read The Outsider, you don't really need to read If It Bleeds. It doesn't really do much. At least it didn't do much for me. I mean, I love spending time with Holly, but in terms of like innovation, really it wasn't that great. And then Rat, I think, is the best story in the collection. It's the last story in the collection, and it is about a writer who gets this bee in his bonnet for the novel. He has tried to write a novel before and ended up having like a breakdown when he couldn't finish it, and he decides to go out to his father's isolated family cabin and write this story. He also ends up picking up like a flu. There's a big winter storm. I liked the story the most out of all 4 in the collection. Again, it's nothing new for Stephen King. It explores a lot of similar elements from other works. Ever since I became like a Stephen King fan, I started buying all of his new releases as they come out, and this book has me deeply considering whether or not I will pick up his new work, as in buy it, versus borrowing it from the library, because the past, I would say 4 releases, new releases that I've picked up by Stephen King have been kind of meh. As much as I am enjoying reading through his older works, his like back catalog in publication order, a lot of this newer stuff just isn't doing it for me. And I mean, I have limited space. I will probably never reread If It Bleeds, short of some sort of reading project, like if the Red Rum Book Club is still going. And the last book that I read in 2020, again, cleaning up that currently reading pile. I moved into 2021 with just 10 books on the pile, which is pretty great considering that when I started this project of cleaning up the TBR pile in November, I think, I had 27 books on the currently reading pile. So the last book is The Vagina Bible by Dr. Jen Gunter. I started because I saw it everywhere at Indigo and I was like, all right, let's see what the hype is about. And the first bit of it is very basic. If you have had any sort of sex ed or pursued any sort of sex ed as an adult, you probably got this. But really, I think the book sort of got a little more interesting and I started actually learning new things once you get beyond like Vulva 101. Some of the stuff that I found the most fascinating was like stuff around toxic shock syndrome and tampons, that you can still get toxic shock syndrome with a menstrual cup because it's related to a specific bacterial culture and that you have to have that. It's something like 1 or 4%, I can't remember off the top of my head, of people with vulvas, people with vaginas, actually just have this bacterial culture, and like everybody else, I guess, can just be a little bit more careless with how long they leave things in their vagina, because if you don't already have this bacteria, you're not gonna just manifest it out of nowhere. I feel like the only place you really hear about toxic shock syndrome is like on the instructions for tampons that come with each box, which is the manufacturers covering their butt. They're not going to be like, most people don't have to worry about this, because they want everybody to be safe and also use more products, right? I think the most helpful part of this book, and I think it applies to any doctor's appointment that you go to, oftentimes we know something is wrong, like whether it's with your reproductive organs or your stomach or your head, right? Like we know something is not right, but then we go to the doctor's appointment and in trying to speak what is wrong for the first time, we don't quite capture what we mean. Her advice is before you go into any appointment, write down what you are feeling, write down where it is, what it feels like, so that when you are talking to the doctor, it's not the first time you're trying to verbalize, is it pain? Is it an itch? Great advice. Those are the books that I read in the last chunk of 2020. Let me know what your favorite book from 2020 was. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this possible. I really appreciate the work that you enable me to do. For folks interested, the tiers have just been revamped. I will leave that video linked above if you are interested in supporting the channel, in participating in book clubs and the live stream discussions that go along with that. Those are available to patrons at all tiers, so for as little as $1 a month, you can join the smaller community for book club discussions. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye!